Hi, I'm Colin from the Ohio State University's Noble Gas Laboratory. To build on a previous video about using a copper tube to sample for dissolved gases at a groundwater well, I'm going to show you what we would do to a groundwater well, or for example a spring that has low flow or is bubbling in regards to the spring itself. As in our previous video, this is our 3/8 inch OD copper tube setup with the swage lock plug valves, stainless steel tubing, and Tygon flexible tubing. Now the key for a low flow condition is to make sure we aren't allowing air back up on the downstream end of the Tygon flexible tubing. So to prevent that, we submerge the end of the tubing into water. This can be a bucket of water, as I've shown here in this example, but it can also be really any, like if there's a pool of water, if you're at a spring and so forth, that you can just resubmerge the end of the Tygon tubing. That way the water will act as a seal that will prevent air from moving buoyantly back up into the copper tube as we try to flush our copper tube setup with sample. In this demonstration, I'm beginning with our sample setup already attached to the sample port there. And when I open the valve to release the water, it'll be important that we try to facilitate the sample actually flushing through the setup here. In order to do that, we can basically not keep the copper tube as elevated as we would otherwise, as well as keeping the end of the Tygon tubing from submerging too deep into the pool of water we are using. Basically, the deeper it goes, the greater the hydrostatic pressure and the more difficult it is for air bubbles to be flushed out of the system. So when I open this up, we're going to see air being flushed through. We'll see bubbles traveling through the setup and then hopefully bubbling down on the downstream end. So water has made its way through the upstream end of the Tygon, and now I'm going to try to get it to come out the other end. There it goes. And you can see it's bubbling pretty well, and I want to try to remove all of the air. Basically, the entire Tygon tubing needs to be filled with sample. Now, if this was a spring that happened to have gas bubbles, the same concepts still apply, but we will also be seeing bubbling probably through this whole process. And that's okay, because the gas will make for even better measurements in those cases. Okay, now that I've successfully flushed out the majority of the air that was in there, I can begin my normal procedure, which is the light tapping of the metal parts of the sample setup, try to release any bubbles while this downstream end of the tubing is slightly inclined. I can exercise the valves. Do one more round of tapping. The key in low flow conditions is to basically remove that initial volume of air that occupies our sample tubing prior to letting the sample flow through. So at this point, normally we would try to wait for 50 volumes of the entire sample setup to be flushed with sample. In low flow conditions or spring conditions, we may not be able to achieve that. So at an adequate amount of flushing, we can just go ahead and take our sample. So the downstream end first is closed, then the upstream, and our sample is secure and ready to be detached and clamped as with previous procedures.